Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. Our next guest has written a book which I think is a very important addition to the national conversation about technology, privacy, and economy. Frank Pasquale is professor of law at the University of Maryland. His research addresses the challenges posed to information law by rapidly changing technology, particularly in the healthcare, internet, and finance industries. We've been following his work for a long time. We're delighted to have him on the program. Frank, thanks for joining us.
Oh, terrific to be here, RJ. Thank you.
Listen, I wanted to, first of all, thank you for writing this book. I do think it's a very important part of the conversation, and perhaps we could start, although I have read it, by asking you perhaps to summarize what you're telling us in this book.
Sure. This is a book that I've spent several years writing because I was really intrigued by the power and the peril behind new technologies. And I started out looking at Google. And I was really excited at Google, about 10 years ago. I thought, wow, this is amazing. I can now find all these videos and books and articles that I never could find before. And I started writing articles that were actually about how we needed to change copyright law to make it easier for Google to organize things. But as I went to more conferences about it and talked to more people, I found people that had problems and complaints, and they could never find a person to talk to. And I'm sure we're all familiar with that, where you have a problem with a company and like no human will respond to you, nobody will take your case seriously. And as I started listening to them, I started expanding the scope of what I was looking at to like data brokers, the credit bureaus, credit agencies, et cetera. And what I found united a lot of these companies in the new digital data economy was that they were trying to make us more and more open about all aspects of our lives, but they were really closed about how they processed our data, how they used it. And I found that actually the worst offenders there were in the finance sector, the big banks. And I start the book actually looking at how a lot of big banks, they say that they're run on the best technology and they're using the best data and they have the smartest rocket scientists behind them. But if you really try to look at the inner workings of their operations, there's just a wall of silence and it's impossible to get at that.
Well, when we talk about the big banks, and we will get to all the aspects of it, that brings up a question that I wanted to ask you in reading the book, which is, you said it was, although you do talk about banks, you do talk about the economic implications of this technology and so on. You said it was a very deliberate choice on your part to call this book The Black Box Society and not The Black Box Economy. So I was wondering what your thinking was, why you made that choice.
Oh, what a terrific question. Thank you. And I chose the society rather than economy because my argument towards the end of the book is that there is no economy anymore. And what I mean by that is that the top players in our economy are so reliant on government help, they're so reliant on sort of manipulating the rules in their favor, that it's wrong to sort of talk about an economy that sort of exists, say, outside of the political sphere or is this separate sphere. And this was a big message of Thomas Piketty's book in Capital, was that we need political economy. We need to not just listen to economists when we're thinking about the distribution of goods and benefits and burdens in society. We have to listen to all sorts of social scientists because the economy is so much driven by especially the special favors that are sought by these big black box firms in Silicon Valley and Wall Street.
And I want to get back to those special favors. I think that's a fascinating topic. We're talking with law professor Frank Pasquale about his book, The Black Box Society. But one of the things that strikes me in that conversation about why we can't just listen to economists about the economy of this new technology is I think that one of the new commodities that perhaps economics has not yet internalized is human attention, human awareness, the dissemination of knowledge, that these are all commodities that are being increasingly manipulated. Perhaps this is part of the social dimension you're referring to, that are being increasingly manipulated by for-profit companies for their own ends, and that perhaps people are not aware enough of the ripple effects of that. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And what I've really loved is even after the book came out, there are all of these studies that emerge that show exactly what you're talking about. So, for example, on Facebook, these researchers at Michigan have shown that a lot of people, when they're using Facebook, they think, oh, if I see the most recent stories, I'm seeing everything from all my friends. And these researchers actually got Facebook to allow them to use this API that would show everything that's being posted at once on the left side of the screen and then what you see on the right side of the screen. And people were shocked to find out that they weren't seeing Facebook status updates from their best friends, from their mother, from their brother, etc. Those were being elbowed aside for the types of posts that would make Facebook the most profit.
And this is true even if people have selected, which they don't make it easy to do, the recent stories rather than the top stories option on Facebook?
That's right. There's incredible filtering. And what really scares me is that some of the people at the top of Twitter are talking about introducing the same thing to Twitter.
Right. And again, I think the issue here is I don't think people understand the power of that, both economically, but I'm going to pose a hypothetical, and maybe this will sound a little paranoid. But let's say we had the terrorist attack in Paris last week. Let's say that someone at Facebook or one of a similar company, Twitter, decided to filter my feed. I don't think they would, but this is a hypothetical. Decided to filter my feed so that I only saw tweets from people who had arguments in favor of suspending civil liberties until the terror threat was over. They could conceivably use that power to change the national political mood and promote specific policies, couldn't they?
Yes, that's exactly right. And there was actually 2 studies that have looked into the possibility of this being used to manipulate elections. So to give an example, they did a study at Facebook about how if they put very prominently on Election Day a signal or a thumbs up or some sort of notice that says, hey, remember to vote, and here's a polling place near you. If they did that, that actually would increase the turnout among the people who were prompted that way by 0.6%, 0.7%. Well, there are lots of elections that are decided by less than 0.6 or 0.7%. And they use this sort of technology for political targeting, too. So Politico had a magazine article last week or 2 weeks ago called The Viagra Vote. And it talked about, political operatives using people's marketing profiles to directly target ads at people based on, say, if they had, were a certain profile. And
right.
What I think is just amazing about all of this is that they polled voters, and 84% don't want this sort of targeted manipulation. They think, this is unfair. But there's no agenda to stop it because it is so useful to the people who are wealthy enough to take advantage of it.
So that raises so many questions, and I do want to get back to it, but I want to make sure that we cover all the dimensions of your book. One of the things that you also brought up is the equivalent data manipulation problem. Well, I guess let me put it this way. We're talking with Professor Frank Pasquale about his book, The Black Box Society. I guess the way I look at it is there is the garbage in and the garbage out problem. And the garbage in might be what you and I see on our Facebook feed, or if they start changing it, the Twitter feed, or Google searches, or Google News searches, or whatever. So there's the filtering and the manipulation of reality that takes place for individuals who use these now ubiquitous products. And that's one channel, and obviously it's pejorative to say garbage, maybe that's the wrong word, but the other is the use of the information that we are freely surrendering in return for access to these products for free. You raise a question, for example, should a credit card company be entitled to raise a married couple's interest rates if they know they've entered into marriage counseling? So, just as one example. So we are also, as we enter into this black box society or enter deeper into it, we are surrendering deeply. I don't think people understand the depth of the invasion of privacy that's taking place. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, that was an example that really worried me, the one about the credit card company looking at what people were charging and then categorizing them after that. And a lot of folks in finance say, oh, they always use this very innocuous examples. Like they say, if somebody puts felt on the bottom of the legs of their chairs, they put little pads on the bottom of their furniture. It turns out that we've learned that they're more likely to pay off their bills than others, and we'll reduce their interest rate, we'll raise their credit limit, et cetera. But what some enterprising reporters have also turned up is that there are the negatives, the opposite side of this happens. And so people start getting categorized exactly on that basis. For example, if the credit card companies reserve that ability to charge more to someone, and they say, oh, we're not discriminating against people because of they went to marriage counseling. It's just that probabilistically we can predict that they are more likely to run into financial difficulties and default than others. But
well, yes, of course. And I'm not sure we'll have time before the break to fully explore, but to me, it seems one of the things that I think happens is that people ascribe a certain magic to what happens through digital technology when some of these conceptually have been around for generations. For example, what you just described is not all that conceptually or theoretically dissimilar to an old insurance practice called redlining, which you know well, in which people who lived in certain neighborhoods, as in lower income, as in minority neighborhoods, might be more likely to be victims of crimes, might be more likely to have burglaries or automobile accidents or whatever. And when this was brought up as a civil rights issue, and a fair access issue, and it still exists today in various forms with payday lenders and auto loans and so on, the answer is always, but we're just being probabilistic. It's not that we're not going after their ethnicity or their skin color, or we're just using probabilistic models. So I guess we only have a minute to go now, but maybe in 20 seconds, and then we'll explore it more. Is my analogy to redlining a fair one?
It is, and Lori Andrews, a very interesting lawyer, calls it weblining. She says this is the new data discrimination.
So I didn't think of it first, but I can live with that because I think it's important. Maybe when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the, whether this is in fact a Faustian bargain that people are engaging in order to access this technology, and some other examples of it and what we might do about it. So we will be back after this break with Professor Frank Pasquale, author of The Black Box Society, about talking about technology and its impact on our lives. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. This is Richard Eskow, and we are back on the Zero Hour with Professor Frank Pasquale, law professor and author of the new book, The Black Box Society. We're talking about the impact of new technology on privacy, on rights, on the economy. And before we went to the break, I mentioned this Faustian bargain where people are trading their most personal information for access to free technology. And this quote from your book, Frank, jumps out at me. It was when he was asked, Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO of Google, who was famous at one point for roughly saying something along the lines of privacy is over. Eric Schmidt once said, and quote from your book, Google policy is to get right up to the creepy line, and not cross it, end quote, to which I say, that quote is creepy. And isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And, and the funny thing is now the tech oligarchy, the folks in Silicon Valley often say back, well, creepiness isn't an objection. If you feel weird about something, you've got to have a better objection. But to me, actually, when people feel creepy about something, usually it's because they have an intuition and a sense of imminent harm. And I think we need to respect people's sense of creepiness rather than, get right up to it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. People's intuition is great, and by the way, you might be more transparent if you didn't think it would creep people out even more. So I guess then the question becomes: do people understand I mean, even someone, I write about this topic myself, but I've tried to go through Facebook and Google and what they allow you to know about what they know about you. And I don't feel I have a strong idea about what they really know about me, because I haven't seen the algorithms that say, for example, that if you put Velcro or whatever it was, felt on the bottom of your chair, as you were saying, then you're more likely to pay your bills on time. Do people have any idea what information about them is being disseminated and for what purpose?
I think some of these companies, they make efforts that I think of as more token efforts than as really the legitimate real thing that would be necessary for people to really understand. So, for example, they'll give you your web search history, they'll give you certain things, but, in terms of what are the inferences drawn from the data, how is the data used, what types of sensitive data is there? Is there health information? How is that deployed? It's really hard. And some of the companies will say, oh, well, we're not going to use your health information in X, Y, or Z ways. But on the other hand, who can audit that? How would we ever be able to find out if they did use it in certain ways? It'd be very hard to. And the final example that I think is really humorous is something that Natasha Singer at the New York Times uncovered, which was, Axiom. She was reporting on Axiom, a major data broker, and she couldn't find out about the information they had on her. And after the New York Times sort of did some articles, Axiom said, oh, well, now we're going to let people see. We're going to throw open the doors and shine some sunlight for people. Well, it turned out that they only gave people an extremely limited view of what they had, and in order to get access to it, you had to enter like 50 more pieces of data. So,
right.
So,
right.
It was really like you were losing more privacy in order to gain some sense of what was going on. It was funny.
Well, it's funny, but it's also not, because it shows the enormous power they have over people. And of course, the anecdote that came up after your book was out, was that of the Uber executive who told an assembly of people, showed I forget what they call it, their God's eye view, their big screen of where every car is and every customer, and suggested that they might spy on an unfriendly journalist and in order to compromise or embarrass her. And then, of course, they walked it back when it became public. But do we really know? It seems to me the ethos of the Silicon Valley, such as it is very lax when it comes to protecting people's privacy, and we don't even know to what extent this is being done.
That's right. And the other issue, too, with Uber, and I think that Jeff Nunberg called God's view or God's eye view the word of the year for 2014, because it so perfectly captured the power asymmetry. You have 10 people, say, in some startup that can look at all of the Uber card trips that people take, and then millions of people that are potentially being spied on. And I think you're right also about the problem with protecting privacy. The biggest problem that I see is that even when the firms often violate their own promises, or they, fail to put in place like basic security measures, and the penalties are so low. So one of the examples in the book is, the Federal Trade Commission documented Facebook violating 5 rules very clearly, violating either their own promises or federal law. And it was like an afternoon of revenue for the company, or an afternoon of profit for this major case. And I think that's the other problem, is that it's just we don't have even if the companies are trying to follow the law, they're not really facing any really serious penalties if they break it. That's what I think is another huge problem here.
And there are companies like Uber, and by the way, I have a huge problem with that name, but it's a very Nietzschean name, it seems to me. But there are companies like Uber which openly flout regulations, and their business model is clearly to go into new markets, flout the taxi cab regulations because people are frustrated, shortage of cabs and so on, and then build up enough of a market share so that their users demand that the regulations be repealed. So I would argue that, I've come at it from a slightly different angle when I've written about these companies. I've tended to talk about how they use monopolistic practices that, in my opinion, would be they would not be unfamiliar to 19th century railroad tycoons, for example. but I don't know if you agree with that. I don't know if the way they use these secret algorithms, to use your subtitle, conforms with that, or if there's a different problem in play here. What are your thoughts?
I think the railroad tycoon comparison is very smart, and I think that and I would also compare them to like natural resources tycoons, like the dictators that happen to find a giant pool of oil under their country. And I want to pursue the oil analogy first, and I can come back to the transport one. But a lot of these companies, if you ask them, so for example, I heard an interview of like the head of Airbnb, and I'm sure Uber would say something similar. You ask them, well, hey, wait a second, why is your company valued at billions of dollars or tens of billions when someone else could just code up the same thing, in a matter of like a week or so and release it? And what they'll always say is something like, yes, they could do that, but we have the recommendations and we have the evaluations that are out there from all of the users. That's the same thing, by the way, why YouTube was valued so highly when Google bought it, and why it's valued even more today is because all the users they've rated the videos, they have added keywords so they're easy to find, etc. And all of this is uncompensated work that the users are doing. And so to me, it's like all of that labor out there that like people who are boosters like Clay Shirky call cognitive surplus. Well, that work is being capitalized on, and only a very tiny elite is getting it. And to me, all of that work that we're doing, the users are doing, that's like the oil in the ground. And then you look at a country like, say, Equatorial Guinea or Saudi Arabia or et cetera, you see there's like a tiny elite at the top that gets to use that resource, and it isn't really equitably shared. And I think that's how we have to start looking at these new big data companies and the finance firms too. They're taking advantage of what is really ultimately a shared resource or something that we have all contributed to.
A shared resource built on government-funded technological breakthroughs, it might add. But Frank Pasquale, law professor, I think that's a tremendous point. And while you were talking about that, I was trying to coin a neologism, and what came to mind was micro coercion. That there are times when we voluntarily supply this information, but there are times when it's coerced out of us. The obvious example is the CAPTCHA screen, where we're supposed to verify or translate an image into a word for book translation, book digitization, before we can go forward. But there are also, I once used Airbnb, and there were some misrepresentations about the place I lived in, but the guy sent me a message right before he was leaving saying, I'm going to write something very nice about you. Because the customers are rated too. And it was clear that there was an element of, so you better write something nice about me, or maybe your online profile in Airbnb won't look as good, and then you'll pay the price, so you better not mention that there's no parking. Is that micro coercion? Is that part of this sort of involuntary labor force we all represent?
Yes, I think these ratings too, I think, are very troubling, because you wonder, like, how exactly are they operating? I've noticed, for example, on Yelp, I've had some pretty bad experiences at restaurants, and you write a bad review, and that can be buried. And there are stories out there about people who, restaurant owners who are part of like the Yelp partner program, or they're paying dues to Yelp, and then Yelp is somehow helping them to like not make as prominent the negative reviews or even hide them or something. I haven't independently investigated that, but I've heard these stories out there, and I think it's your point about that is similar. I've faced the similar issue with like ride sharing or ride services where,
right.
And the other side of it too that's odd is then you hear, I've heard somewhere that if a driver has below a 4.6, then they can't drive anymore. And then you think, well, wow, like all of a sudden, what's the meaning of this has totally changed. Like what like a random person may have entered into and thinking, okay, that was the average cab ride, I'll give them a 3. Well, once they know about this 4.6 number, then you feel really terrible giving a 3, but so
right. And then
yeah.
Right, and then it becomes another form of currency rather than an actual sharing of information. Listen, there's so much more we could talk about. I'm frustrated that we're running out of time, but in the 30 to 60 seconds we have left, is there any other point you want our listeners to know about your book?
Well, I hope that people really will find it a useful guide to navigating the new internet economy, because I think it's on one level it's a social critique, it's social criticism, but on another level, what I try to do is I try to bring it to like our personal experience of how we're facing the internet, how we face banks, and how we can respond to the black box society and try to do a little bit better than just having no knowledge about it. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for writing the book. It's an important one. Frank Pasquale, law professor, author of The Black Box Society, The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information, published by Harvard University Press. Frank, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been great.
We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.